Odilon Redon's monsters feel impossible, but their anatomy almost never ignores the rules he'd spent years studying. He had a phrase for his own method: putting the logic of the visible world to work for the invisible one. That shouldn't be possible. Monsters are supposed to break the rules of reality. We don't expect them to follow the cold, hard laws of a biology textbook. Folklore colliding with anatomy. That's where we're going today. People call Odilon Redon one of the great precursors of Surrealism, or just an illustrator of nightmares. Neither really covers it. An artist famous for nightmares who chose deliberately to study anatomy. That's the real puzzle here. Redon's monsters came out of a collision between two very different worlds, his mother's Creole background and years spent close to a working botanist's microscope. If you've ever felt like rigid science kills the magic of the world, this might change your mind. Redon's existence began in a kind of cultural limbo. Born in France in 1840, but, as the family story goes, conceived in New Orleans, where his father had built a fortune in the brutal economy of the slave trade, money that would later fund young Redon's education. His father married a French Creole woman, Marie Guérin. Louisiana itself was humid, swampy, a place where French, Spanish, African, and Caribbean cultures collided, steeped in the kind of folklore that history produces.
How much of what follows Redon consciously intended, and how much is a pattern art historians have connected after the fact, is genuinely debated. But the facts and the images line up in a way that's hard to ignore. Start with what Redon wrote himself: that he often wished he'd been born at sea, in a place with no homeland, suspended above the dark abyss of the ocean. Critics at the time called his American heritage almost pathological because his work dripped with dread and compared him constantly to Edgar Allan Poe. Poe wrote the suffocating atmosphere of a room. Redon drew it in charcoal. You can see that same image directly in a piece from 1878, The Guardian Spirit of the Waters, a vast empty ocean, a tiny sailboat below, and floating above it a massive, disembodied human head staring straight down, impossibly heavy but silently hovering. Many read this as Redon's ocean at birth, emerging from the same abyss that separated his mother's world from his father's, belonging to neither. That obsession defined his early temperament, the soil, not yet the plant. Then his attention shifted towards science in Bordeaux, and something happened that actually changed how he worked, not just how he felt.
If studying anatomy limits imagination, why did Redon spend years doing exactly that? Not in an art studio, in a laboratory, next to a friend. The man responsible was Armand Clavaud, a professor of botany and curator of the Botanical Library at Bordeaux's Jardin des Plantes, and Redon's closest friend since his teenage years. The classic pairing, the methodical scientist and the brooding artist. Clavaud introduced him to two things that cracked his worldview open: Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, wildly controversial at the time, and the hidden world of cellular biology. Put yourself in the shoes of someone in the late 1800s, before microscopes were a middle school textbook staple. Watching a single cell divide under a lens must have looked like pure magic. A drop of pond water became a crowded metropolis of bizarre creatures. It redrew the boundary of what counted as alive. Through Clavaud, Redon became deeply interested in anatomy, osteology, and the microscopic world. The two of them frequented Bordeaux's Botanical Garden and natural history collections together, Redon sketching skeletons and microbes while his friend pointed out what to look for. Here's the payoff to that earlier question. Draw a monster with no skeletal logic and your brain files it as a cartoon, flat, fake. Draw one with functioning joints and real anatomical weight, and your brain registers it as an actual physical threat. He understood what makes a body feel believable and used it. By making the anatomy sound, he tricked you into believing the thing could exist. He took a real cell, a real bone, and let it creatively evolve on the page, as if imaginary evolution had produced it. You can see this exactly in Smiling Spider, from around 1881 to 1887, depending on the catalog you check. At first glance, a spider. Fuzzy, round abdomen, hairy, multi-jointed legs, completely realistic. But instead of compound eyes, it has a distinct human face, grinning. It looks like some eccentric guy off a Paris street grafted onto an arachnid. Because Redon had studied anatomy, the neck is drawn with a logic that makes the creature feel structurally convincing, not a collage, something closer to biologically plausible. Just look at it for a second. The weight in those legs, the way the smile doesn't quite belong, and yet somehow does. Science didn't give Redon his nightmares. It taught him how to build them. One loose thread remains. A man this obsessed with hard science ends up, decades later, most famous for painting flower bouquets, not biology diagrams. That's where this story is actually headed. But first, one more monster. This is what's sometimes called Redon's botanical horror phase. Anatomical accuracy applied to the boundary between plant and animal life. Look at Cactus Man from 1881. A standard clay flower pot on a table, but instead of a leafy stem, a human head and neck grow out of the dirt, and the man's skin is covered in thick, sharp cactus needles. He's not screaming. His expression is solemn, almost resigned. If you're new here, this is the kind of thing we do. Stick around. Why fuse a plant and a human? Clavaud believed in a single cellular basis for all living things. Under a microscope, plant cells and animal cells look remarkably similar. Redon's work often reads as though he embraced that idea. No wall between a person and a houseplant, just matter, endlessly transforming. The Cactus Man's thorns double as a crown of thorns, human martyrdom grafted onto a plant. That reading comes up often in writing on Redon. Beyond it, the symbolism opens up further. You could read the pot as containment, civilization drawing a clean border around something wilder trying to get out. That's one way to see it, not the only one. Redon rarely explained his own images, and he seemed to prefer it that way.
You'd expect an artist this deep in cellular horror to just keep descending. Then, in December 1890, Armand Clavaud took his own life. The friend who had done more than anyone else to shape Redon's scientific interests was gone. The following year, grieving, Redon published a series of lithographs dedicated simply to the memory of my friend Armand Clavaud. Instead of pulling him back into the abyss, the loss did the opposite. Though it took the better part of a decade to show, the botanical horror slowly began to bloom. For decades before that, Redon had worked almost exclusively in charcoal, his so-called Noirs, black drawings, literally dust and shadow. Around 1900, roughly 10 years after Clavaud's death, a monobave in charcoal for pastels, and the dark monsters transformed into radiant flower bouquets. Pastel is pure pigment. It catches light. The shift is an explosion of color, azure blues, blinding yellows, luminous pinks, a complete reversal. Take a piece like Bouquet of Flowers, painted in the years right after the shift. At first, it looks like a conventional still life, but watch the petals. They don't just reflect light, they seem to glow from somewhere inside the paper. Among the ideas Clavaud had introduced him to were Spinoza's pantheism and Buddhism, and that glow is close to what pantheism actually argues, not God created nature, but God and nature as the same substance. Not something managing the earth from a cloud, but the dirt itself, the cells, the dividing microbes Clavaud had shown him years earlier under a lens.
When Redon started painting vibrant flowers, they weren't just decoration to help him cope with grief. Read as symbols, they point to spiritual awakening. The Buddhist image of the lotus, which only grows out of thick, rotting swamp mud. Redon seems to have realized his colorful enlightenment could only grow out of his darkest, blackest drawings. The abyss wasn't a trap, it was fertile soil. All those years of spiders and severed heads weren't wasted darkness. They were compost, feeding the light that came later. There's a common fear that explaining how something works makes it less beautiful, that knowing the mechanism ruins the magic. Redon's career doesn't settle that argument, but it does complicate it. Few painters of his generation immersed themselves so deeply in biology, and somehow, the closer he looked at reality, the stranger reality became. His 1914 painting, The Cyclops, is as good a place as any to leave it. A giant mythological monster peaks over a mountain, but the whole painting bursts with soft pastel color, an alien botanical garden. Myth, biology, and light all living in one frame. The monster isn't a threat anymore. It's just another part of a beautiful, bizarre ecosystem. Thanks for watching. If this kind of thing is your kind of thing, subscribe. It genuinely helps. Go back to that monster from the very start of this video, the one with the perfectly real joints, the anatomy that felt convincing. It wasn't invented. It was studied into existence, bone by bone. Somewhere between a Creole household in Bordeaux and a botanist's microscope, Redon ended up occupying a strange place between the laboratory and the dream. Not a label he chose, just the shape his looking eventually took. Redon himself put it simply late in life. My drawings inspire and do not define themselves. They determine nothing. Maybe that's true of the man who made them too.